Hello, and welcome to the MuseScore Café for today, October 10th, 2018. And I want to make sure that everything is in order before I continue. Make sure that you can see and hear. And so hopefully that is the case. I'm checking on my phone and I hear myself. So that's great. Okay, so today my plan is to talk about efficiency and things you can do to work more efficiently in MuseScore. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, I would want to let you know, first welcome. If you are tuning in live, you are encouraged to take part in the live chat, which I will monitor. And in fact, let me pop that out. Hi, Marcus. I'm going to pop out my chat so that I can keep flipping over and watch it. So if you have specific questions about what I'm talking about or suggestions of some of your own time-saving tips, that would be, I would love to talk to you about that. And also if you have questions on other topics, this is really meant to be open-ended. I come prepared with a topic to talk about, but if other people want to if the conversation starts steering in a different direction, that is fine too. So anyhow, I sort of made myself a list of some of the things that I want to tell you about that I think will be most useful to people as far as ways of kind of speeding up your workflow. And I say this based on having answered a lot of questions on the support forums from people saying, wow, is there a faster way to do this? Or is there an easier way to do this? And realizing there's certain things that people that are maybe not obvious. So that is my plan, is just sort of to go through some of these things. So let me just, okay. The very first thing that I want to talk about is just moving around in your score. This is something that a lot of people don't discover right away. I think people tend to discover that if you click the score and drag it, it will move. People are often put off by the fact that they don't see scroll bars here. And the reason there's no scroll bars is, well, most people have mice that have scroll wheels or a touchpad. And so the really efficient way to move about in your score is using the scroll wheel or touchpad. So on my touchpad, 2-finger swipe scrolls up and down, and that's a very efficient way of moving around. If I do that with shift, it goes left to right, and if there's multiple pages, it'll go to the other pages. So 2-finger swipe up and down, 2-finger swipe with shift is left and right. This isn't unique to MuseScore. This is part of how almost all touchpads work, or mouse wheels work, but it's something that we rely on a lot. On some touchpads, like on mine, I can actually use 2-finger swipe left and right. That's what I'm doing right now. But other touchpads, you can't do 2-finger swipe left and right. Some touchpads have a scroll zone, like an area across the top or the side of the touchpad, where if you drag your finger along that, it will scroll. And sometimes there's like a setting for your touchpad to enable things like that. But anyhow, that's just knowing the most efficient ways of getting around in your score. Also, let me open another score here. The keyboard, here's another score of mine. The keyboard as a way of navigating the page up and page down keys. So page down moves a page at a time. Page up moves up a page at a time, etc. So just as far as moving around in your score, those are some very efficient ways that a lot of people don't realize at first that you can do. So hopefully that's useful to some of you. So the next thing, though, that I want to talk about, and it's really kind of a big one, and it's the idea of keyboard shortcuts. Some people, like myself, tend to use keyboard shortcuts for a lot of things and customize them and really go into them. But I would say even if you're not someone who uses keyboard shortcuts for everything all the time, there's a lot of things in MuseScore that you can get a lot of benefit by finding the things you do most often and learning the keyboard shortcuts for those. So one of the things I want to do, and I apologize for not having this already up, if I go, I'm going to go back to the chat, sorry, and if you go here, I have a cheat sheet, and so I'm typing in a, let's see, it's masteringmusescore.com. That's the website where I keep my educational materials. Go shortcuts. So if you click that link, it should take you to a page where I have downloadable shortcut sheets. So I produce them in letter format, in A4 format, and Marcus, was that you? I have the German translation. I think that was you, Marcus, that provided that. So if I have that wrong, I apologize. This is the shortcut sheet, and it lists maybe not every single shortcut that MuseScore has, but a whole lot of them, all the ones that I thought were the most useful. And by the way, if you're curious about every shortcut that MuseScore has, you can also customize them. Edit, Preferences, Shortcuts. And this lists all the shortcuts that are available, and also commands that don't currently have shortcuts, but for which you could add one. Like if you want to have a shortcut to add an instrument change text, right now you can add staff text with Control-T, you can add lyrics with Control-L, but there's no shortcut already defined to add an instrument change. If you want there to be one, there is the ability to define a shortcut for that here. So I'm not so much meaning to talk about customizations, but that's I don't know, that sort of came up when I was showing you this list. So you can define shortcuts for whatever you use the most often, if it's something that's on that list of commands. We don't currently have shortcuts for everything in the palettes here. A lot of things in the palettes do. Well, at least some do. I don't know about a lot. Many do. We're hopeful that in MuseScore 3 we'll be able to have the ability to define shortcuts for everything in the palette. The code has already been written last year as part of the Google Summer of Code. It just hasn't been merged in. There's still some kinks to work out with it, but I'm hopeful that will happen in MuseScore 3. Anyhow, keyboard shortcuts are incredibly valuable for the things you do most often. And for most of us, the thing we do most often is entering notes. So I tend to use keyboard shortcuts more or less exclusively when I'm entering notes. And so to go to note input mode, I type N to go to note input mode. To enter notes, I use the number keys for durations, like 4 for eighth note, 4, 5, 6 are eighth, quarter, half. And of course, that's what, those are the most common note values in most music. So 4 for eighth note, and then I can just type note names. And then the shortcuts like Control down to go down an octave, Control up to go up an octave, and these shortcuts that allow you to enter notes, change duration. So like now I can enter a quarter note by pressing 5 and then typing G. And right now I don't have my program enabled that. Let me just do that really quick because it is kind of cool and useful. If I go, I have a little program, and this is a nice open source thing. There's something called what's it called? Auto Hotkey is a utility that I downloaded and found someone had written a script that would display your keystrokes as you hit them. So when I click, you see that. And if I type a letter, you see that. The way it worked by default, I wasn't crazy about, so I kind of customized it myself, which is a nice thing about scripts, is I was able to go in and do that. The way I had it set up that I wanted it. I don't know that anyone else would want my particular customizations or like them better than the defaults that were in there. But in any case, I'm a fan of open source stuff, and that's one. Turn on my visual. Yep, I just did. So you see that now, right? Yeah, of course, because it's showing you my screen. So, so keyboard shortcuts during note input are some of the most valuable shortcuts. And so you can see here I have most of these listed. So there's up and down arrows to raise and lower the pitch. There's control up and control down to raise and lower by an octave. Alt-Shift up and down is one that a lot of people probably don't know about, but I use a lot. Alt-Shift moves by step. So you see it's like, it's not going in half steps. It's not adding accidentals. It's just staying within the key. And that I find to be a useful shortcut to sort of quickly move a small distance. So anyhow, that's a useful one. Another one that someone just asked about and I answered, and they said, wow, it was a lifesaver. And I've never thought of a keyboard shortcut as a lifesaver, but there you have it. And that is, while you're entering notes, Alt down will move through the notes of that chord. It will also then move down to the next staff. Alt up does the same. Then Control right arrow moves to the next measure. Just like Control right arrow in a word processor moves to the next word, in MuseScore it moves to the next measure. So here you can see that Alt and the arrow will move through the chord, then to other voices if they're present, and then to other staves. So it's really possible to do an awful lot of navigation with the keyboard alone. Now I mentioned that things on the palette, many of them have shortcuts, not necessarily most, but a lot of things do. So like on the the most common articulations have shortcuts. So let me go here, and if I click a note and then I use the shortcut Shift V, that enters that accent. Shift, I have to remember what some of these are. Shift S for staccato, and Shift O is that marcato accent. And there's a few others that have shortcuts or can have them defined. Like you can go to that preferences window and define shortcuts for the bow commands in addition to those. Oh, tenuto is Shift N, I believe. Excuse me. So you can add those by clicking a note and pressing the shortcut. You can also do it while you're in note input mode. So I can enter a note and then immediately make it staccato. C, immediately make it tenuto. So that's another nice use of shortcuts to save some time. Now, if you have a whole passage where you want to enter staccatos all the way through, like maybe I want this passage to be all those 4 notes to be staccato, what I can do is I can apply them all at once. And people might be used to dragging things. Like that's one of the other things that people discover, that you can drag things from the palette to notes. This works, but it's not particularly efficient. So if I enter some more notes, I don't know why I'm so enamored of the C major scale, but that's how I enter notes when I'm demonstrating things. You can select the notes you want this to apply to and then double click a palette icon. And this works for pretty much any palette icon. If you select the notes you want it to apply to and then double click the palette icon, it applies that to all of them. For instance, I can go to Dynamics and say F, and it'll apply the forte to all of those notes. That's not necessarily what you really would want to do. Normally you just apply it to just one note. But anyhow, the point is it works for virtually everything in the palette. I could do that with at least everything that's attached to notes. So I could attach arpeggio signs to everything in the palette, everything in my selection, etc. So by selecting a passage and then double clicking in the palette, that is a very efficient way to add it to everything in that selection. Also, you can, if you want to select all of these arpeggio symbols and then do something with them, there's convenient ways of selecting things. Like I can individually control click these things and do that to select them individually. But that's not an efficient way to select all of those markings. What I can do is instead select the region and then right click one of those symbols and say select all similar elements, or maybe just all similar elements in range selection. And now I have just those arpeggio symbols selected, and now I can do things with them. What might I want to do with them? Well, for instance, maybe I've decided that I don't like the position of them, or maybe I want to make them all invisible. I can make them all invisible at once. And you may also know the shortcut for that is V, and that also toggles the visibility. Or maybe I want to change the position of them. Maybe I want to make them a little closer to the node head, or a little further away, etc. So I can, by selecting a group of things and then using the inspector, I can make those adjustments all at once rather than moving them one at a time. So also, if you are going to move things one at a time, instead of dragging them around, which you can do, but it's kind of fiddly and awkward, I think, anyhow. I'm going to use Control R now, which is the shortcut to reset that position. I can double click something and then use the arrow keys to move things in set increments. What it does is it moves it, you can actually see here under vertical offset, it's moving it 1/10 of a staff space at a time. So if I hit it 10 times, it'll move. If I move it 5 times, it'll move it right onto the line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There it is, right on the line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now it's right in the middle of what would be the next space, etc. Now, so if you're trying to do fine adjustments, double click and then arrow keys is a precise way of doing that pretty accurately. If you're trying to move it by a longer distance, Control arrow moves it a full staff space at a time. So that can be useful also. And I use that when I'm trying to make fine-tune adjustments. So if I'm trying to make manual adjustments to individual symbols, double click and then the arrow keys. If I'm trying to make adjustments to a bunch of symbols at once, then it's best to use that technique that I showed you where you right-click one of them, select all similar elements in that range selection, and then, oops, I just clicked outside it and lost my selection. So select the similar elements and then use the controls here in the inspector to move them all. So I can move them, I can use these arrow keys to move them in increments as well. It moves it in half space increments, or I can just type in a value if I want. I can say I want it to be exactly, 2 spaces. For some reason the display is lagging here, but it's 2 spaces below now. So that is a way of doing manual adjustments is, I find, to be a lot more efficient than dragging. And even if it's not more efficient when you're just doing one, it's when you're doing a lot and realize that then you can make the same adjustment. Like if I adjusted this by double clicking and then doing Control up to move it one line, I could then do the same adjustment very quickly here rather than trying to line things up manually and all stuff like that. So using these as ways of making your manual adjustments efficiently is useful. But even better is if you don't have to make the manual adjustment at all. So let's say I'm entering some lyrics here. And just like I like the major scale, I like numbers when I'm entering lyrics. Oops. There's no reason I couldn't have stuck with right. So here's some lyrics. And what if I've decided I want to change the font of this? Well, yes, you can double click this and then select the text and come down here and change it to be, that's the downside of the visualization, is it does obscure some things. So I could change it to be 10-point font here. Or, change it from free serif to something else. I can do that individually, and I can also move things individually if I want it higher or whatever. I can do that one at a time and then try to line them up. That's not going to be very efficient, though. So I'm using Control-Z to undo that. If I want to take all the lyrics on this line and move them lower, I can select the range and then right-click a lyric. Did I right-click a lyric? Yes, I did. Select all similar elements in range selection, and now those lyrics are selected, and I can move those as a group while leaving any other lyrics not moved. So for instance, if I just wanted to select from here to here, and by the way, that in itself is a shortcut worth knowing. Click something, shift click something else. That's the basic way of selecting a range. And again, that works in most programs, not just MuseScore, but in MuseScore, it's definitely your best friend for making selections. So now that I've selected just those first 5 notes, I can say select all similar elements in range selection and apply some vertical offset there. And just move those. But if I want to move them all, I don't want to have to mess with any of that. I just want to change the default position for lyrics. Well, for most things in MuseScore, there are defaults for these things. And for lyrics, lyrics are actually a complicated one because the spacing and the way it tries to automatically allocate space, there's a lot of complications, a lot of different settings available. But if I go to, I went to Style and then General. Here, let me walk that through again. I went to Style, General, and then Page. You see that there's a setting here for the margin above the lyric and a margin below the lyric. So I could just increase that and say I want this to be, so again, it's just for some reason glitching on me. I wonder if it's that auto hotkey script that's causing it to glitch on me, because it's not supposed to respond this way. It should be responding more directly. Now it says 5. There we go. Yeah, so it's not updating, and it's never done that. Anyhow, I can increase that top margin, and notice it just moved all the lyrics down, and that will affect all the lyrics throughout the score, including lyrics I haven't entered yet. Right? So these will also obey that. So these also have more space. These are now, I had started to move them, right? I had applied a vertical offset to them. What I could do at this point is I could just select everything and say, you know what, all these manual adjustments I made, let me just undo those. Let me just reset them. So I'll select everything and Control R. So, because I would much rather not do manual adjustments. I would much rather get the defaults the way I want them using style settings. So the default style settings are designed to produce good results in many cases, but every score is different, and there could be reasons why you want your lyrics higher or lower. Like maybe you have a lot of notes below the staff and you need your lyrics a little lower. And maybe you are trying to save space and you don't have many notes below the staff, in which case you could have your lyrics a little higher. So every score is going to be different as far as that goes. You will also find that when you create a score from a template, each template might customize some of those settings. Now, to be honest, a lot of the templates just go with default style settings for a lot of things, but some of them really do customize quite a lot. The jazz templates in particular customize a lot of things to produce results that make sense in a jazz score. For instance, when I talk about that, I mean things like setting the font to this Muse Jazz font, and setting the chord symbol style. This is an a cappella arrangement, so there's actually not any chord symbols, but if I show you the lead sheet version of that same score, this was created with the Jazz lead sheet template, and it uses things like a slightly larger staff size than the default. It has larger chord symbols than the default. It uses the Muse Jazz font everywhere. It also does some subtler things like making bar lines a little thicker and some other settings. Oh, making voltas higher so that they don't conflict with chord symbols. So anyhow, the style settings, you can have templates. The templates that are provided might customize those, but if you make your own customizations to your style settings, then you can just save that as a template. Just save the score to your own templates folder, and then that'll be available. Like I've done this before when I create a new score. I just pressed Control N, and I'll skip past the first screen. But when I then go to create a new score, you'll see I've created a template for chants, which doesn't really have much. I did that more as a test. I did the piano quintet template. I think I did that during one of my Café demonstrations. And this one for chord chart that I put together as a result of some forum discussions. Let me show you what that one looks like. The chord chart one is designed so that there is, when I type chord symbols here, how did I do that? You know, to be honest, I think it had to do with putting fret diagrams on the staff. It was something that, you know, someone was asking what the best way to do something was. So yeah, I apologize for not remembering why I created that one or how I did it. It was done as a test. It's not one I actually use, but but anyhow, you can create your own. So that's a way that if you do make customizations to your style settings, you can reuse them easily. So what else is there as far as ways of saving time? Well, these are a lot of the really important ones that I wanted to talk about. If anyone who's watching has any ideas or any questions, please feel free to take part in the chat. If you're watching on my website or anywhere where this is embedded on a page, you might not see the chat widget, but if you click the YouTube icon or link, it'll take you to the YouTube page if you're not there already, and you should see the chat there. And you can feel free to give your best suggestions that you have or questions you have. Well, is there a better way to do this or that? Or if you just have other questions about anything else, I'm very open to talking about what people want to talk about. I'm going to take a look at this score meanwhile. Many of you may remember this score. It used to be the demo score for MuseScore for a long time. I wrote this back at, I think, MuseScore 1.2, I think. And I wrote this to be a demonstration of MuseScore and what it could do. And I wanted to show off as many features as I could. Oh, by the way, I wanted it to sound like music. And so, you know, I think I did a pretty good job on both counts. I actually like the piece a lot, and I get a lot of nice comments on it. But it has a ton of things, excuse me, that it demonstrates that MuseScore can do. And you can actually learn a lot by studying this score. So actually, let me go ahead and post a link to that score. I would like to think if I go to musescore.com, see that one thing about this score is because it was the demo score in MuseScore for a long time, a lot of people basically testing out the Save Online feature. Sorry, my computer's, anyone who's watched this before knows that my computer slows to a crawl while I'm broadcasting live. Well, you probably think it's this way all the time because you only see me when I'm broadcasting live. But yeah, that's something I didn't realize would be the case. But at some point, maybe I'll invest in a faster computer. All right, see you later, Marcus, and thanks for being here. So if I search for Reunion, I'm going to actually find a lot of scores because a lot of people actually uploaded my demo score while they were testing the Save Online feature. Yikes. Okay, sorry about that. So that doesn't mean I have to go. It's just a reminder I have set. So Reunion, if you go and visit the score here, so I will put this in the chat. Oops, the chat's going to pop out. I will put this link in the chat. If you study this score, you will see, you know, a lot of the techniques that I use, and this was actually created, as I said, in MuseScore, I think 1.2. So there's some newer things. If I were to show off what MuseScore 2 can do, there's other things that I might be showing that aren't in here, although realistically, most of those things have to do with workflow, things like creating linked parts that aren't just like things about how the score looks. I guess fretboard diagrams weren't in MuseScore 1, so that I don't think they were. So that's maybe something that if I were to produce a demo score now, maybe I would include some fretboard diagrams or something. But I don't even have chord symbols in this one. But I do have all sorts of things. I have those arpeggio symbols. I have tuple. I have a triplet here. I use multiple voices, including 3 voices here with a manual adjustment applied here. I have all sorts of things going on. I have clef changes in the middle of the measure. I have a key change here. Oh, by the way, clef and key changes, that's something else I should point out. A nice way of doing that is if I decide that I want this passage from here to here to be in another key, select the range and type the key and double click the key signature. There we go. So when I do that, it applies the key signature right there. It also should have showed me the change back to C major at the end. You can see it did change to C, but for some reason I'm not actually getting what I expected here, which is a courtesy key change. So now I'm a little curious about that. Let me undo that and let me try this, the dragged method. Because every once in a while in these demonstrations, I discover a bug. And so this is what I expected to see, was the courtesy change. And apparently that didn't happen when I used the double click method of applying the key change. Is that always true? Well, it happened here, but it didn't happen here for some reason. So I'm not sure what actually happened there or why it happened, but anyhow, it's because I applied it here and then it changed. Anyhow, I'll investigate that. I don't need to bother you guys with it, but there it is. It should have had a courtesy key change there, and it didn't, but it just doesn't. It's because there's only one measure on this line. I think that's why. I think there is a known bug where courtesy key changes to C major don't appear if there's only one measure on the line. Anyhow, I will verify that has been reported, but I'm pretty sure now that I see that there was only one measure on the line that is a known bug. All right, so we're getting pretty far afield from my planned topic of just talking about ways of working efficiently, but hopefully by watching how I do things, you get a sense that how much I can do with keyboard, how much I can do with double clicking in the palette versus drag and drop, how much I can do to allow me to take one action that affects many elements or all elements rather than doing so many things one at a time. For instance, if I decide that these staves are too close together, some people might be trying to drag spacers in from the palette and drag in these spacers and one at a time increase the space line by line, but that's not the best way of doing that. If you want more space between systems, there's a style setting for that. Style, general, page, and then there's actually a minimum and a maximum system distance, and this is so that the distance between systems kind of floats. If there's fewer systems on the page, it'll add more space between them to kind of fill out the page. But by increasing the minimum distance to say 12, and again my auto hotkey is I think interfering with my ability to work this. At least that's what I'm blaming for now. I'm actually going to turn that off for a second and see if that's the case, because something is definitely interfering. So if I increase it to 12 and hit apply, you'll see now that the staff space the space between systems has increased score-wide. So when possible, find style settings to make a change globally. Find ways of selecting multiple elements and applying adjustments using the inspector to everything at once. Use double-clicking in the palette to apply symbols to multiple things at once. And keyboard shortcuts, keyboard shortcuts, keyboard shortcuts. These are the things you can do to save time. So speaking of time, I have been talking to you for about a half an hour. Sometimes on these chats I go, I try to average about a half an hour on them. Sometimes they will go long if we're really into some deep subject, and sometimes they'll go shorter. but I think that I've said the things that I wanted to say about working efficiently in MuseScore. There's, of course, many things that MuseScore can do, and probably efficient ways of doing all of them and less efficient ways, but I've tried to hit on the things that I find that people most commonly are maybe not finding the most efficient ways of doing. So hopefully this helps some of you find work a little more efficiently when you're using MuseScore. Before I go, last thing I guess I would like to do is just put in the plug for my online course. You've heard me talk about that if you've been to other of these cafes recently, but this is a brand new thing that I've just developed, and it's an online course that just consists of, this is a half hour of me sort of going on, and hemming and hawing my way through whatever I'm doing. The online course is much more step by step. There's 100 individual lessons there, 9 hours of video that really take you through every single feature of the program. It is the most complete way, the most comprehensive way of learning MuseScore from the very basics. I start off just entering, Mary Had a Little Lamb, just showing you the very basics of entering notes and lyrics. And but then I go on to all the complicated details of page layout and working with linked parts and transposition and everything there is to do in MuseScore I talk about in this online course, and I really can't recommend it highly enough if you really want to master MuseScore. So anyhow, I hope that you find this demonstration of working more efficiently in MuseScore useful, and I will see you next week. Thank you.